The Ottoman Empire was one of Europe's oldest and longest-lasting empires. It stretched from the Balkans down through to the Red Sea. But by the end of the 19th century, many of the different ethnic groups and Turkish citizens wanted a more democratic system, as opposed to the oppressive monarch ruled by Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The Young Turks were a political reform movement and eventually party that pushed for reform against the Sultan. In July 1908, the Young Turks forced the Sultan to reconstitute the 1876 constitution, which allowed for multi-party voting among citizens. After the revolution, the party began to split into two factions. The first was made up of pro-decentralization and pro-minority liberals that originally formed the centrist Freedom and Accord Party. The second was the nationalist pro-centralization radical right wing of the Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, whose leaders were the three pashas. They seized control of the government and brought the empire deliberately into World War I, so they could have complete control over the empire during wartime. Talat Pasha became prime minister, Enver Pasha was minister for war, and Djamil Pasha was minister for the navy. By 1915, they were fighting the Russians in the Caucasus and losing. Russia was a primarily Christian Orthodox nation, and the Ottoman Empire was primarily Muslim. But they did have Armenians living in the empire who were Christian. These people were the perfect scapegoat for the failures of the Ottoman Empire. Since both Russians and Armenians are Christians, and from 1915 to 1923, over 1.5 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire were suspected and accused of Russian collusion, and were systematically ripped from their homes, marched across the deserts with little to no food or water, and murdered in death caves by the Muslim Young Turks political party. Christian Greeks in the empire weren't spared either, as 300,000 of these people were murdered by the government, effectively cleansing the Ottoman Empire of Christian Greeks. Armenian men were rounded up and sent to the front lines or to work as slave labor for the war effort, and when the work was completed, they were executed. Even though Armenians were second-class citizens, they did a lot better than the Muslims living in the empire, so a growing resentment was already in play when the order was given to cleanse the empire of Christian minorities. Over 1 million would be deported, homes and goods were confiscated or stolen, and churches were turned into mosques. Women, children, and elderly were snatched from their homes and thrown into the streets, regardless if they were clothed or not, and weren't given any time to grab valuables, only just some scraps of food. Photography of the deportation was illegal, but some German photographers were brave enough to capture some of the images of the event. Ironically, the German government would sanction the same horror onto another group of people almost 30 years later. Deportees were taken to Syria and central Turkey by foot. Many elderly and sick citizens would collapse from the long journeys and left behind despite the plea from their families to stop. Orphan children would be raped and sold to Arabian tribes, where they would force the children to undertake new identities. The survivors of the marches would be sent to death camps, which were usually just large caves in the middle of the desert. Armenians were gassed, burnt alive, and tied back to back, where one person would be shot and the other would be dragged underwater by the dead person to drown. One cave had over 3,000 Armenians burnt alive, with only 15 surviving by hiding in certain crevices. They would have to feed on burnt human flesh to survive. This genocide continued past the First World War and would go into the 20s and finally come to an end with the formation of the new Turkish government. But to this day, the modern Turkish government denies the events that transpired over 100 years ago. Survivors even showed reporters the locations of these mass graves that held the murdered Armenians, and they contained thousands of full skeletons and bones. Recent documents that have been revealed to the public show government orders to cleanse the empire of Armenians by deporting them and having them systematically murdered en masse. The Allies even issued warnings to stop the massacres, but they were ignored by the government. The fate of the three pashas could be considered poetic justice. All three men were found guilty of their crimes by the new Turkish government, led by Mustafa Kemal, who was the lead commander of the Gallipoli campaign and widely considered a national hero by the Turkish people. He despised the three pashas, despite having to work with them since they were his superiors. But not anymore. Djamil Pasha would go to Georgia at the request of the Soviet government to assist in negotiations between the Soviets and the Afghans. He was identified by members of the Socialist Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which was a political party that formed in 1890 and still operates to this day in Armenia, Lebanon, and Iraq. They were on a global hunt to track down perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide, and they just hit the jackpot. Talat Pasha was guilty of crimes against humanity, but before he could be detained, he fled the empire along with the other two pashas. Talat fled to Germany, where he was granted asylum, and when the Turkish government asked that he be extradited, the request was denied. It seemed he would escape justice, but he would eventually be spotted by an Armenian soldier named Sagaman Talerian, whose entire family was wiped out due to the genocide. He shot and killed Talat, was detained by the authorities and tried. The trial made major headlines in newspapers, and this was the public's first exposure to the genocide. Tillerian would be released, as it was agreed that his mental stability had declined due to the horrors he experienced at the genocide. Talat Pasha's remains would be held by the German government until 1943, when the Nazis sent his remains to Istanbul, where he was buried with full honors. Enver Pasha also fled to Germany, where he built many relationships with German Soviet leaders, who wished to further progress the relationship and interests of the two nations. The most significant person Enver Pasha met with was the leader of the Soviet Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, who requested him to go to Bukhara city to quell uprisings against the Soviet government. However, Enver secretly met with the rebels and convinced them to join his side. He would help them defeat the Soviets, and they would help him to create a pan-Turkish nation. He would later be found by an Armenian Red officer in Tajikistan named Yakov Melkumov. Enver was camped out with 30 of his men when Yakov and his soldiers attacked the camp. Enver rode out with 25 of his men, but he would be gunned down by machine gun bullets. As of 2020, almost all NATO nations, including the United States, acknowledges the Armenian Genocide, with one exception being Turkey. Their denial is likely due to the fact that they are also a NATO nation that doesn't wish to lose their NATO privileges based on their horrible past. Only time will tell if these wrongs can be given some form of correction by the Turkish government, but it's important that we keep these memories in our consciousness as to never forget those that died needlessly for leaders that sanctioned senseless mass murder because they didn't want to be held accountable for their own failures.